The silence of the Kentucky morning was shattered at exactly 5 a.m. on May 17, 2005, when a 911 call pierced through the dispatch center in Alexandria. The voice on the other end was that of a woman, desperate and terrified, screaming words that would haunt the quiet community forever. "Someone broke in. They shot my husband." Then, in the midst of her panic, the line went dead with a thunderous crash that left dispatchers frantically trying to reconnect. Within minutes, police cars were racing through the winding roads of Campbell County, their sirens cutting through the dawn air as they rushed toward what they believed was a home invasion gone horribly wrong. When they arrived at the rustic log cabin nestled deep in the woods south of Alexandria, they found a scene that would be seared into their memories forever. The house looked like a war zone. Kitchen cabinets hung open, their contents scattered across the floor like confetti at a twisted celebration. Drawers had been yanked out and overturned, their contents spilled everywhere. In the bathroom, prescription bottles lay scattered across the tile floor, and the mirrored medicine cabinet stood wide open, reflecting the chaos below. Glass from a shattered rear door crunched under the officers' boots as they carefully made their way through the destruction. But it was in the master bedroom where they found the most devastating scene of all. There, kneeling beside the bed as if in prayer, was the lifeless body of Robert "Bob" Bosley, a man who had built an empire from nothing and was beloved throughout the community. His body was riddled with gunshot wounds, his blood staining the hardwood floor of the home he was building for his family's future. Bob Bosley hadn't been just any victim. Born on August 2, 1962, in the heart of Alexandria, he had grown up in a religious, close-knit family that instilled in him the values of hard work and determination. Even as a young man, Bob had possessed an almost supernatural drive to succeed, a vision that would carry him from humble beginnings to extraordinary wealth. Starting with nothing but a dream and an unshakable work ethic, Bob had begun his journey as a one-man chimney cleaning and roofing repair service. Day after day, he would climb onto rooftops throughout Campbell County, his hands growing calloused and his back growing strong as he built his reputation one shingle at a time. His pricing was fair, his work was impeccable, and his friendly demeanor made him a favorite among homeowners who appreciated his honest, straightforward approach. What started as a solo operation slowly transformed into something much larger. Bob's one-man service evolved into Bosley Roofing and Chimney Sweep of Alexandria, a thriving enterprise that became synonymous with quality, efficiency, and reliability throughout the region. But Bob's ambitions didn't stop at roofing. As money began pouring in from his successful business, he set his sights on real estate investment, systematically acquiring rental properties throughout the area. Eventually, his portfolio grew to include around 20 rental properties, each one adding to his already impressive income stream. By any measure, Bob Bosley had achieved the American dream. He was one of the area's most successful businessmen, a self-made millionaire who had earned every dollar through honest work and smart investments. Success, however, brought its own temptations. Bob's newfound wealth translated into a lifestyle that was both lavish and controversial. He collected luxury sports cars that gleamed in his driveway, maintained a stable of beautiful horses, owned his own airplane, and possessed a sizable boat that became legendary on Lake Cumberland. But it was his arsenal of expensive firearms and the wild parties aboard his boat that began to raise eyebrows throughout the conservative community. The boat parties on Lake Cumberland became the stuff of local legend. Raucous affairs filled with loud music, flowing alcohol, and scantily clad guests who seemed to embody everything that Bob's religious upbringing had taught him to avoid. Yet there he was, the successful businessman by day and party host by night, living a double life that would have consequences he never could have imagined. It was at one of his favorite local restaurants where Bob's life took a turn that would ultimately lead to his destruction. There, serving tables to put herself through college, was 18-year-old Amy Pave, a young woman whose beauty was matched only by her determination to escape the limitations of her working-class background. Amy had been born in 1969 into a family that knew the meaning of struggle. Her father's battle with alcohol had cast a shadow over her childhood, and financial limitations had been a constant presence in her life. But Amy was different. She was determined to break the cycle of poverty and disappointment that had defined her family's history. After graduating high school with top honors in 1986, she had enrolled in business studies at a local community college connected to Northern Kentucky University, working as a waitress to fund her education and her dreams of a better life. When Bob walked into her restaurant that fateful day, Amy must have seen more than just another customer. Here was a man who represented everything she had ever wanted: wealth, success, security, and the promise of a life far removed from the struggles of her youth. Bob, for his part, was immediately drawn to Amy's youth and beauty, her quiet reserve that seemed so different from the wild party girls who populated his Lake Cumberland adventures. At first, Amy remained cautious, perhaps sensing the danger in getting too close to a man whose reputation for wild living preceded him. But Bob's charm was irresistible, and gradually, Amy found herself drawn into his world of luxury and excess. She began attending his notorious lake parties, slowly becoming a regular fixture in his inner circle of friends and admirers. But Amy was different from Bob's other companions. She didn't remain just another guest at his parties. She captured his heart in a way that surprised even him. Their relationship grew serious over the course of 4 years, and finally, the successful businessman and the ambitious young woman walked down the aisle together in what seemed like the ultimate fairy tale transformation. For Amy, the marriage represented the complete realization of her dreams. She had gone from serving tables to marrying one of the most sought-after bachelors in the region, from worrying about paying for college to living in luxury beyond her wildest imagination. When their daughter Morgan was born in 1996, followed by their son Trevor 3 years later, it seemed as though Amy had achieved everything she had ever wanted. The transformation was remarkable. Amy, once the carefree partygoer who had joined Bob's wild adventures on Lake Cumberland, shifted seamlessly into the role of devoted mother and respected community member. Her nights of partying and excess were replaced with school functions, church activities, and the countless responsibilities that come with raising 2 young children. She became the picture of respectability, the successful businessman's wife who had found her place in the world. To the outside world, the Bosleys embodied everything that was admirable about the American dream. They were attractive, successful, and generous with their time and resources. Bob often donated his services to low-income families, and both he and Amy were deeply involved in their church and their children's school activities. Bob's name was respected throughout the community, and Amy was seen as the devoted wife and mother who had helped her husband achieve even greater success. But like so many fairy tales, the Bosley story had a dark side that remained hidden from public view. Even as Amy settled into domestic life, Bob found himself increasingly restless. The responsibilities of running a successful business, managing multiple properties, and maintaining his various investments began to weigh heavily on him. He particularly resented the administrative aspects of his empire: the payroll management, tax obligations, invoice processing, and contractor coordination that seemed to multiply with each passing month. Bob was a man of action, not paperwork. He preferred the freedom of the open water to the confines of an office, the thrill of a business deal to the tedium of tax forms. Weekends often found him disappearing aboard his boat, sometimes for days at a time, refusing to tell anyone where he was going or when he would return. It was during this period that Bob made a decision that would ultimately cost him his life. Frustrated with the administrative burden of running his empire, and knowing that Amy had studied business administration in college, he asked her to take over the company's financial and administrative responsibilities. At first, Amy seemed hesitant. Managing a multimillion-dollar enterprise was a far cry from serving tables or managing a household. But eventually, she agreed to take on the role, and from that point forward, she became responsible for the company's books, payroll, and most importantly, its tax obligations. It was the beginning of the end. Amy's role as administrator had given her access to the complete financial picture of Bob's empire, and with Bob increasingly distracted by business expansion, his lake adventures, and the construction of their dream house, Amy quietly began to exploit that access in ways that would ultimately destroy everything they had built together. Instead of paying the company's substantial tax obligations to the Internal Revenue Service, Amy began diverting those funds into an undisclosed personal account. The embezzlement was carefully planned and executed. She would receive the money that should have gone to the IRS and simply redirect it for her own use. The scheme was so well concealed that it went completely unnoticed for years, even as the unpaid tax debt continued to grow larger and more dangerous. But as every criminal eventually learns, no one can avoid the Internal Revenue Service forever. The IRS had been tracking the company's missing tax payments with the methodical precision that had made them feared throughout the business world. They issued repeated letters demanding payment, made numerous phone calls trying to reach Bob directly, and even attempted to schedule face-to-face meetings to resolve the growing crisis. The problem was that Bob never received any of these warnings. Amy had anticipated this day would come, and she had prepared for it by arranging for all IRS correspondence to be delivered to a private mailbox that only she could access. Every letter, every notice, every demand for payment was intercepted by Amy before it could reach her husband's attention. She was well aware that the government was closing in on their company, but perhaps she believed she could continue stalling indefinitely. Or maybe she was simply buying time to figure out a way to replace the stolen money before anyone discovered what she had done. But time was running out faster than Amy realized. The IRS had grown tired of being ignored, and they were preparing to take more aggressive action to collect the debt that had grown to over $1.7 million. They had scheduled a meeting with Bob for the morning of May 18, 2005, and this time, they were not going to accept any excuses or delays. Amy knew that this meeting would be the end of everything. Once Bob sat down with the IRS agents, the truth about the missing tax payments would come out immediately. Her years of embezzlement would be exposed, her marriage would be destroyed, and she would face criminal prosecution that could send her to prison for decades. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built, would be lost in a single morning. But Amy was not prepared to lose everything without a fight. As the date of the IRS meeting approached, Amy began to formulate a plan that was as desperate as it was deadly. If Bob died before the meeting could take place, she reasoned, his assets would be more than enough to cover the tax debt, and with him gone, no one would ever know what she had done. She could emerge from the tragedy as the grieving widow, collect on his life insurance, inherit his business empire, and start fresh without the burden of her crimes. The plan was cold, calculated, and utterly ruthless. On the night of May 16, 2005, just hours before Bob was scheduled to meet with the IRS, Amy made her final preparations. Some reports suggest that she may have sedated the children to ensure they would sleep deeply, though this was never definitively proven. What is certain is that she retrieved one of Bob's own firearms from his extensive collection and made her way to their bedroom where her husband lay sleeping, completely unaware that his life was about to end. What happened next would haunt the Alexandria community for years to come. As Bob slept peacefully beside her, trusting and vulnerable, Amy raised the gun and fired. The first shot wounded him, but didn't kill him immediately. Bob awakened in shock and confusion, probably not even realizing at first what had happened. When he saw Amy standing over him with the smoking gun, he must have experienced a moment of disbelief that quickly turned to terror as he realized that the woman he had loved and trusted with everything was trying to kill him. According to investigators, the trajectory of Bob's wounds indicated that he had tried to lunge toward Amy, perhaps attempting to disarm her or escape. But wounded and weakened, he was no match for her determination. She fired again and again, until the man who had built a fortune from scratch, who had trusted Amy with his business, his money, and his life, lay dead in the bedroom of the home they were building for their future together. The killing was only the beginning of Amy's carefully orchestrated deception. With Bob's lifeless body still warm beside her, she began the process of creating the crime scene that would support her story of a home invasion gone wrong. She retrieved the family's aluminum baseball bat and used it to shatter the rear door, creating what appeared to be a point of entry for the fictional intruder. She then went through the house systematically, opening cabinets, pulling out drawers, and scattering belongings to create the impression of a burglar searching for valuables. In the bathroom, she opened the medicine cabinet and scattered prescription bottles across the floor. In the kitchen, she opened cabinets and drawers, including the ones beneath the sink, an odd place for a burglar to search, but Amy was operating under extreme stress and probably not thinking clearly about the logic of her staging. But Amy's most crucial task was hiding the evidence of her crime. She carefully collected 4 of the 6 spent shell casings from around Bob's body, wrapped them in a cloth, and hid them at the bottom of the family's washing machine. With the physical evidence hidden and the crime scene staged, Amy turned her attention to creating injuries that would support her story of being attacked by the intruder. Using what were likely scissors, she made small, symmetrical cuts on her chest, wounds that were designed to look like defensive injuries from a struggle. She then carefully cut and tore her blouse to make it appear that it had been damaged during the alleged attack. Finally, it was time for the performance of her life. Amy called 911, and when the dispatcher answered, she unleashed a torrent of panic and terror that was so convincing it fooled everyone who heard it. Her voice was frantic, desperate, filled with the kind of raw emotion that seems impossible to fake. She screamed about an intruder, about her husband being shot, about the horror that had supposedly just unfolded in her home. Then, to add authenticity to her story, she created the crashing sound that cut off the call by throwing something against the wall. The performance was flawless. When police arrived at the scene, they found exactly what Amy had intended them to find: a house in complete disarray, a murdered husband, and a traumatized wife who appeared to be a victim rather than a perpetrator. The responding officers immediately began treating the scene as a home invasion, and Amy was handled as a victim who needed protection and support rather than a suspect who needed investigation. At the police station, Amy continued her performance with remarkable consistency. She described the intruder as a white male with a nasal voice, bad breath, and a distinct odor of urine, details that were specific enough to seem credible but generic enough to describe thousands of men. But even as the community mourned and feared, detectives were beginning to notice inconsistencies in Amy's story that made them increasingly suspicious. The crime scene, while certainly chaotic, didn't quite look like the aftermath of a real burglary. The way items were scattered seemed too random, too purposeless. Real burglars tend to focus on specific areas where valuables are likely to be stored, but this looked more like someone had gone through the house with the sole purpose of creating disorder. The broken rear door was another red flag. Most of the shattered glass was found outside the house rather than inside, which was inconsistent with someone breaking in from the exterior. If the intruder had smashed the glass from outside, most of the fragments should have fallen inside the house, not outside where they were actually found. Then came the discovery that changed everything. While searching the basement of the house, investigators found the family's washing machine and decided to look inside. There, soaked in water, were items of clothing, and at the bottom of the machine, wrapped in a folded cloth, were 4 additional shell casings that matched the 2 found in the bedroom. The discovery was stunning. What kind of fleeing killer would take the time to hide evidence in the victim's own washing machine? The finding made no sense if the crime had been committed by an outside intruder, but it made perfect sense if the killer had been someone who lived in the house and had time to carefully conceal evidence. Near the washing machine, investigators also found the aluminum baseball bat with fresh scratches and white residue on it. When the bat was later tested, the white residue was found to match the glass from the broken rear door, confirming that the bat had been used to create the false point of entry. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Staff members from the Internal Revenue Service had heard about Bob's murder and contacted the police with information that provided the missing piece of the puzzle. They revealed that they had been trying for months to contact Bob about a massive unpaid tax bill of over $1.7 million, and that a meeting had been scheduled for the very morning that Bob was found dead. Even more shocking was the revelation that during previous phone calls, IRS agents had spoken to someone who claimed to be Bob, but the voice was strange, high-pitched, and clearly unnatural. To the trained ears of the federal agents, it sounded like a woman attempting to impersonate a man's voice. That voice, they now realized, had been Amy's. With this information, the motive for Bob's murder became crystal clear. Amy had been systematically embezzling money from Bob's company for years, diverting tax payments that should have gone to the IRS into her own private accounts. The total amount she had stolen was staggering, nearly $2 million that Bob knew nothing about. But perhaps the most heartbreaking evidence came from the mouths of babes. When investigators interviewed 9-year-old Morgan and 6-year-old Trevor separately, both children gave identical accounts of what they had heard that night. They had been awakened by 6 gunshots, they said, and only after the shooting had ended did they hear the sound of glass breaking. Amy's version of events had the sequence reversed. She claimed the glass had broken first, alerting her to the intruder's presence, and then the shooting had begun. Children don't lie about such things, and their testimony was devastating to Amy's defense. The timeline they described matched perfectly with the physical evidence and the scenario that investigators had reconstructed. Amy had shot Bob first, then staged the break-in to cover her tracks. Less than 2 weeks after Bob's murder, authorities had enough evidence to arrest Amy Bosley and formally charge her with homicide. The woman who had once been seen as a victim was now revealed to be a cold-blooded killer who had murdered her husband for money and to cover up her years of embezzlement. The evidence against Amy was overwhelming. The financial motive was clear, the physical evidence was damning, and the children's testimony was unshakable. Ballistics testing confirmed that all 6 bullets that had struck Bob matched the 6 shell casings that had been collected, 2 from the bedroom and 4 from the washing machine. The gun that had fired those bullets was eventually found hidden in Amy's handbag, tucked behind a wardrobe in the house. As Amy's trial approached, prosecutors prepared to present a case that painted her as a calculating murderer who had betrayed the trust of the man who had given her everything. Faced with the likelihood of a conviction that could result in a life sentence, and unwilling to put Bob's children through the trauma of testifying against their mother in a lengthy trial, prosecutors offered Amy a plea deal. Under the terms of the agreement, Amy would plead guilty to Bob's murder and accept a sentence of 20 years in prison. In exchange, she would avoid a trial, spare her children the ordeal of testifying, and receive a reduced sentence. Most importantly for Amy, she would never have to reveal what she had done with the nearly $2 million she had stolen from Bob's company. On November 2, 2006, Amy Bosley walked into the Campbell County courtroom wearing a green and white prison jumpsuit. Her demeanor was unreadable as she prepared to face the family of the man she had murdered. Before the judge pronounced sentence, Bob's family members were given the opportunity to address Amy directly and tell her how her actions had destroyed their lives. Bob's brother James was the first to speak, and his words were filled with pain and anger. He called Amy a liar and a fraud, telling her that while she might one day enjoy freedom again, she would never escape the memories of what she had done. He reminded her that every night for the rest of her life, she would see Bob's face in her dreams, and she would remember the tears of the children she had orphaned. Deborah, Bob's sister, asked the question that haunted everyone in the courtroom. "Did he beg you to stop? No one would ever know." Then came Bob's mother, Audrey, heartbroken and trembling, reading a letter filled with grief over a final goodbye that never came. Amy sat silent, eyes on the floor, wiping away tears. The judge, bound by the plea agreement, condemned the damage Amy had done not only to her husband, but to her children, her community, and her own future. He sentenced her to 20 years in prison. Under Kentucky law, she became eligible for parole after serving 85% of her sentence. That meant 17 years behind bars on May 17, 2022, exactly 17 years after Bob's murder. Amy Bosley, then 54 years old, walked out of the Kentucky Correctional Institution for Women. Most news outlets barely noted her release. Her current whereabouts remain unknown, but some believe she may have gone in search of the millions she once siphoned away. As for Bob, his final resting place is St. Stephen's Cemetery in Campbell County, Kentucky, a man remembered for his generosity, ambition, and devotion to family, cut down by the very person he trusted most. In hindsight, Amy's actions seemed both tragic and senseless. She wasn't destitute, her husband wasn't cruel, the IRS might have worked out a settlement, and if her motive was revenge, a divorce might have left her richer and free, but instead she chose murder. And as the old American proverb goes, one made famous by Benjamin Franklin, nothing is certain except death and taxes. In Amy Bosley's case, both came knocking. Please complete.